So as you guys have both transitioned back to the United States, you're teaching at a university, you're interacting with students. Do you find the innocence guilt um, worldview still the most prominent one, or do you see a shift occurring right now?
We just think is a huge shift um, because, and that's why we're working with Crew on this project. They realize themselves that when people start off with the four spiritual laws, it's predicated upon the fact that people are guilty for their
Hmm.
sin. But what if they don't experience guilt at all? Or what if they're not fearful or shameful? And where do you start? So we think the shift is towards this indifference slash belonging with purpose. And therefore, we're working with Crew in order to develop a presentation of the gospel that is predicated upon that worldview assumption.
What about the honor shame worldview? You mentioned that there's research in the book. You mentioned this. There's research that seem to indicate that there is a, I don't want to say a new incarnation, but there is the rise of the honor shame in the West.
Yeah. So I would say that's definitely a factor because part of that is when you move away from, so our society, Western society, was really anchored in clear images of right and wrong. And so that's
Mhm.
kind of been deconstructed, especially over the last, people can argue, 50 years, 100 years. I mean, but you have to have something. And that is what is my standing in the group? How does the group perceive me? And so that's really the essence of honor shame. People are very concerned. The rise of social media has brought about prevalence. There's like this public shaming. And some of these, someone just makes an innocent statement, they're called out. They're just called out and shamed for it. That's a huge thing. So yeah, I think that's been real prevalent. That's been something that's really been on the rise there. Um, for for the younger generation is how do they appear in the eyes of their peers? That's a big thing.
Yeah, Bud mentioned in the book, that the honor shame worldview, it requires an audience.
Yeah.
The shame requires an audience, and you get a large audience with social media. So as a result, the whole shaming aspect is on the rise, and therefore the aspect where Christ offers honor to people, where your honor is restored, that is increasingly relevant with people.
How does that differ from what we see though in other cultures like Saudi Arabia? I know when most people that I interact with, you mentioned the honor shame idea, they think honor killings and they automatically are turned off. But how is it different than what we see in other cultures to here? Because it's similar, but it's different.
Yeah,
Right.
there's some similarities.
Yeah.
Um, Now, of course, in the US, a lot of it's mediated through digital means, right?
Mm.
So that's a difference altogether. That community is digital, and there's the whole rise of like the metaverse and virtual reality, et cetera. That's a world that it's not my world. I'm not in it, but I know several folks that are, and therefore that honor shame being mediated through digital means has some changes to it, but it's so new, Travis, that we really don't have any experts in this area yet. We're still uncovering this, and quite frankly, when we started teaching about 7 or 8 years ago in this practical evangelism, we only had the first three worldviews. It wasn't until into this program, as we're doing research, that we realized people are indifferent and they needed a different approach because there's a different worldview altogether. So just that to say that research is still happening and still needed in order to understand those differences you're talking about.
Do you think that that indifference is primarily within a Western context? I mean, do you see or hear people talking about the indifference being in other contexts besides the United States or Canada, North America?
So I would say this. I would say it's prevalent. When I talk to people in Brazil, they say it's very prevalent in educational institutions, mainly universities and that kind of culture, where people seem to have this growing indifference. So there seems to be some type of correlation there between the rise of education and people seeing themselves as untethered from their worldviews. And someone told me this, so this is super interesting. Um, People come out of a very rural context in a third world country, and they move into a university setting, they say it just takes them a few years for them to totally change their worldview and to think about what is important to them. Suddenly they realize what I'm doing can remain completely unknown to my family, and there's like there's like in this fluid place, and they become indifferent in a lot of ways. Yeah,
Yeah, so this indifference worldview has been there, but
yeah,
we think that secularization has accelerated that presently. And as secularization continues to increase, and in areas where it continues to increase through like globalization, migration, et cetera, this indifference also is on the rise.